This is the E-commerce Brain Trust, a podcast about building momentum online for established consumer brands. Join our hosts and their expert guests for high-level conversations about e-commerce strategies, trends, and innovations. Access our brain trust and boost your brand's e-commerce potential.
Welcome to the E-commerce Brain Trust podcast. I'm Julie Spear, head of retail marketplace services at Acadia, alongside my co-host, Jordan Ripley, director of retail operations at Acadia. And today we are very lucky to have two of the brightest minds here at Acadia. They spend their days thinking about all things organic optimization for their partners on and off Amazon, respectively. Our first guest is a first-timer on the podcast, I believe, Brittany Flanagan, head of CRO at Acadia, and someone who has more than 15 years of experience in growth marketing across brand and agencies. So welcome, Brittany. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here. Excited.
And we have a returning guest, our very own Julian Galindo, senior account manager within our retail team and noted expert on all things organic on Amazon. It's an area of passion for him, so be prepared to hear the excitement in his voice. Welcome back to the podcast, Julian.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here and looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be exciting.
I am excited as well. This happens to be my favorite zone of conversation when it comes to all things retail marketplaces and Amazon. So just be prepared to hear a lot of geeking out here.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Well, how about we go ahead and get started? And first, I want to dig into what does it actually mean, CRO? Starting with you, Brittany, can you give our listeners kind of an elevator pitch, 30 seconds on how you would describe the role of good CRO? And then we can toss it over to you, Julian, around your high-level take on how you think about this in the world of Amazon.
Absolutely. Yeah, excited to be here. It's also my podcast debut in general, so first podcast, so bear with me. CRO stands for conversion rate optimization, and it's really the process of using data to understand your customer, understand how they're using your website, and then optimizing your website to better meet their needs and ideally increase conversions. A good CRO is using things like heat maps, scroll maps, surveys, and then, of course, lots and lots of A/B and multivariate testing. We're typically splitting traffic, showing different versions of the site to different users, and then measuring the lifts and then implementing accordingly. CRO is really all about the power of compounding gains. So it's really making iterative, seemingly small changes that then work together to compound into significant and big results.
And it's a pretty good segue into Amazon because it's really the idea of what is going to work best to improve conversion rate of a product page or give customers an optimal experience to understand your product or brand better that could lead to conversions or purchases in the future. And so thinking about it that way, it's very data driven. And so you need to listen to what the data tells you when you're coming up with an experiment or the concept, right? And if you're looking for an improvement of, say, your main image, like it's all about having two options and seeing which one works best and then utilizing the data to analyze if it worked, understand why it did or didn't, and then what do you do next? And on Amazon, it could be anything from your main image to your title to your bullet points or content in your A+. So the opportunities are endless in terms of ways you could potentially test things on Amazon.
That might be a good segue. Starting with you, Julian, since you mentioned that opportunities are endless. Do those opportunities, does the view of conversion rate optimization, organic optimization on Amazon look different now than it did 5 years ago? Are there things that are fundamentally different now, whether it's through tools or capabilities on Amazon or how customers on the marketplace are able to interact? Are there some things that you would call out that are fundamentally different now that impact how you look at things?
Yeah, I think from where things were a few years ago to where they are now, it's definitely something I think Amazon is making data more available to people and brands and agencies who work on accounts to be able to understand customer trends and even the impact of like an A/B test that you can run within Amazon's platform of like your main image to see which one would favor conversions more. In the past, there was a lot of manual reporting that would go into, oh, I have this idea. I've got this period, I'm going to run a change on this title. And then for 2 months, I'll come back and see how the data or what the data tells me in terms of, did I get more sessions, more conversions? Did I see an increase in clicks? All of those kinds of KPIs. While Amazon really only gives you conversions now, there's a lot more data available with the A/B testing on that platform, which is great. I think there's still a need for additional reporting outside of that, but it's a good foundation. And I think it's very straightforward that you can share with your team or with a client in terms of something specific. Whereas in the past, you kind of had to brainstorm on, okay, how can I organize everything into a Google Sheet? And then how do I summarize this and present it confidently and say, okay, my idea worked, or this test was a good idea. So we should do more of these for other items.
Yeah, I have some very creative looking sheets documenting my tests back in 2015.
Yeah.
Isolating variables and all sorts of things. But how about in the world of D2C, Brittany? Are there any fundamental differences between 5 years ago and today?
Yeah, absolutely. Similar, I think, with what Julian was saying as far as data. I think on the D2C side, we have really, at this point, unlimited data. We see everything and can track everything that the user is doing, which is really a game changer. And I think particularly now in the kind of post-cookie era that we are in, I think for companies having the ability to own that data and really understand how your users are using that site, using your site, how different changes are impacting your users' behavior, and then owning that data yourself versus having to have that customer behavior information owned by other people, I think is really powerful. And that's definitely a big shift that's happened. As far as the other big things, I would say is around technology. Definitely seeing a lot more of AI personalizations, that kind of stuff has really ramped up in the last 5 years, as well as just the quality of the experimentation tools. So Google optimized sunsetting in 2023 was a big shift for the CRO industry. And it's really opened the floodgates for every A/B testing tool out there to come onto the market and compete against each other. And that's been a huge shift.
The AI personalization, you're doing split tests now where you're surfacing various creatives or landing pages or that sort of thing that are Gen AI produced, or what does that actually look like?
Depends on the level of resources the company has.
Sure.
But typically, especially for the medium to smaller size brands, it's typically often around, it's a lot of recommendations, things like different recommendation algorithms. So if somebody's coming to the site and they're browsing on a specific product, the level of the recommended products or the level of the bundle, the AI generated bundle that's driven by looking at the user's behavior of saying, hey, users like this user have bought these products together. So these are the best products to show on this product page, things like that. There is definitely the personalization element as understanding what users are coming from, which traffic sources, and then adjusting things accordingly. I'd say you have to have pretty large traffic to be able to do that at scale well. So it's sometimes less accessible for the kind of mid and smaller size businesses, but definitely at the larger size companies.
Yeah. Okay. So then you're testing whether the implementation of this sort of AI recommendation engine increases total basket size or something.
Yeah,
like that.
or different algorithms. So should we show related products, or should we show people who have viewed the same products or people who have bought the same products? So there's lots of different algorithms that you can test against each other.
Yeah. Something that was interesting that you touched on, Brittany, and Julian and I've talked about this a bit too, is Google just sunsetted their native. Oh, you said a year or so ago that they sunsetted their native testing? Yeah. Whereas Amazon is sort of taking the opposite tack here of allowing for more native on-platform A/B testing over the last 2 to 3 years. Any sort of speculation around, we have these two digital giants that are heading in complete opposite directions. Any speculation as to what's driving that?
I have some. I don't know, Julian, if you want to go first.
Yeah, sure. I think data on Amazon has always been hidden. They don't share a lot with brands and with people who work on the platform. They try to keep everything as internal as possible. But I think the shift that's happening in terms of how Amazon fits into business in general for brands, understanding that it is no longer an afterthought. I think Amazon is starting to release more information and data that's available to people to strategize to, I really should pay attention to this marketplace maybe more than I have been, because I can get all this data around people who are cart abandoners or people who are high spend customers, and I can target them specifically with certain ideas or campaign. That was not available. And I think because of the way Amazon is shifting in terms of a priority for shopping, they're like, well, there's an opportunity here, right, to even continue to grow and maximize the data that we're going to let out a little bit at a time so you can strategize to push traffic to this marketplace even more. I think that's a big driving factor, in my opinion.
If you as a brand convert more, Amazon sells more, Amazon gets a referral fee, right? There's dollar and cents behind this. Whereas like Google is not taking a cut on each of those D2C sales. They have less of a financial incentive to build out those tools.
And brands have been asking for that stuff. There's still data that you can't get on Amazon. We're like, oh, I wish we could just get this. Like it would open up so many ideas or opportunities for campaigns, but maybe in the future.
Yeah, it'll come.
Yeah, Jordan, that's exactly what I was going to say. I feel like Amazon has all the incentive in the world to help their sellers sell more. Whereas I think with Google, there just wasn't a big monetization opportunity with Google Optimize. And the sunset of Google Optimize happened around the same time as the launch of GA4. So I think it was probably a business decision on Google's side of, hey, we're going to put our eggs in the data basket and then really focus on making GA4 integrate with all these different A/B testing platforms and really push the selling of Google Analytics 360 and that side of things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's a good lead into something that I wanted to dive into, which is comparing the explosion of both media spend and conversion rate optimization on Amazon, at least in capabilities. Explosion might be strong, but advancement, we'll say, versus where it's a little bit more established outside of Amazon with D2C. And I can think about several years, a decade or so ago now, where it was like CRO was kind of the domain of the growth hacker. And you would have these SaaS companies, especially in the SMB space, where it was like, oh, how many landing pages can I build out? How can I squeeze another penny out of each bit of inbound traffic? And I feel like we hear a little bit less about CRO now. And I think there's no dollars in spend of CRO that you can point to in a big e-marketer trend line. That's my theory as to like why it's a little bit undersold. And I also think that there's probably not like always, when you're working with a brand, Brittany, like a CRO center of excellence that you work with the CRO person on the brand side. All of this to say, when you're engaged with a brand and it's like this sort of nebulous space of CRO, who are you working with? How do you manage that cross-functionally? I'm interested on this from an Amazon perspective too, but maybe starting with you, Brittany, what does this actually look like in terms of an ongoing project and who you're interfacing with?
Yeah, such a good question. I think there's a lot of theories I have as to why CRO isn't always given the visibility that I think it deserves. Yeah, CRO is really this magic hybrid between marketing, dev, creative, and analytics. And because of that, you're exactly right. A lot of companies don't really know where it should live within the different departments. And for us on our side, we do typically have multiple POCs and are working with trying to coordinate between, okay, here's our primary dev point of contact, here's our primary creative point of contact, here's our marketing person, and then trying to get them to all agree and align them on the different testing. We are seeing more and more companies have kind of a digital experience team that's typically housed under marketing. It really requires a marketer, though, who is not afraid of dev and is not afraid of data. And I think most marketers are pretty comfortable in the data space, but the dev space can scare a lot of marketers. And you really have to find that as someone who is comfortable in being able to wear all those different hats and knows enough dev to be able to comfortably communicate and speak to developers, which I think a lot of more brand marketers are less comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Julian, from your side, if you think about the sort of successful optimization sprints where you're implementing a good cadence of CRO tactics, what does that team look like that you're working with on the brand side?
Yeah, it can get pretty big. Depending on who you're working with, there could be brand leaders who might have a different vision than the marketing director, right? About there's an overall plan for the year, but they want a certain brand within that company to speak a certain way. When you're speaking to CRO opportunities, you're saying we should do this. And they're like, yeah, but if we don't talk about this technology, we have to talk about it. And you kind of have to outline, we can still do that, but we need to be able to test freely at the same time. Like, I'm not trying to tarnish your brand. It's a simple test that we need to do, right? And getting people on board, it's not the easiest thing in the world because they think they're protective of their reputation and their brand.
We always just say, test it.
Yeah.
Right. Agreement. And that's one of the beautiful things about testing is you can just be, hey, when in doubt, test. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes we do have, oh, this is so-and-so's version, and this is this other person's version. We have little friendly competitions of which version we think is going to perform well. And oftentimes our clients are then kind of almost betting internally on which version they think is going to outperform. It's actually really fun to be able to use data, though, to answer some of those bigger marketing questions.
Always.
We had a client who launched a new product, and internally they were really struggling to decide what they should name the product. There was a lot of internal debate. No one could agree. And we ran a really clean A/B test. We tested, I think, 4 different names during their soft launch. So we could really solidify with data which name was going to land and resonate best with their customers. And it wasn't the name that the CEO wanted, but it was the name that a lot of the marketers were pushing. And you know what? They went with the data. And luckily, that was a client who trusts data. And they went with the data and they had a really successful launch.
And I think that that's a perfect example, right? Because the conversation that I always try to have is the data doesn't lie. We are running this and we're making data-driven decisions. And while you may feel so strongly about the way this is worded, let's run a test, to your point, and let the data show us what is actually going to be the better option. And sometimes you may be wrong in pushing back, and sometimes they may be wrong. But again, having that data ultimately makes it so much easier to have that conversation of, and we know where to go from here based on that.
It's very humbling. A/B testing is very
It makes things a lot less precious when you follow the data. That's for sure. Yeah. The idea of following the data to really drive your processes is key in all of CRO. But is there an element of CRO where you have, these are the universal best practices versus what's best and specific for that brand? Your audience wants this, but you should be speaking to that. Kind of like what you just talked about with the naming of the product, what was in the title itself. I'm curious how folks working on the agency side rather than the brand side, if there are any things that lead up to CRO testing where you work to understand the customer, the category, the product's purchase and consideration cycle, and anywhere that you might encounter friction along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to say we know where the dartboard is, but we don't know where the bullseye is yet. We have a general idea of what typically works. What are our typical best practices? What have we traditionally seen win and outperform? But the exact implementation for your customer, for your brand, that's where testing comes into play. Oftentimes we will do things where, let's say, we'll make a positive UX improvement, something that we know, hey, we know this UX is just better than the UX that you have now. Let's say we're optimizing a navigation, for example. We might have, okay, here's the UX that we want to use for the new navigation, but we're going to have multiple variants where we're testing the order of the elements in the navigation or what the featured products are in the navigation to really figure out what's the best way to implement this best practice for your site, for your brand, for your products.
Yeah, and to that point on Amazon, there's kind of best practice when you think of product pages in terms of how many images do you have in your listing, what do your bullet points look like, and how are those formatted to speak to the most important features of a product, and then do your bullet points and your images match, right? So that way that there's cohesion between somebody who may be on mobile or on desktop, but making sure that you're putting what's most important into images so people can understand the product quickly. And then things like that are common, but to her point, it could be what works in the footwear category is completely different than what works in a camera category or a supplement category. And there's niches within those, and you can play the game according to that. But there are things that you can do and should do from a CRO or optimization standpoint to make sure you're checking off all the boxes.
There's checking off the boxes, but then the actual best practices, understanding the category, the customers, the nuances of that category. That's the actual best practice. If you're only checking the boxes,
right,
hitting the yes, no.
You don't do it just to do it. You make sure that you do it, but whatever that box is, it's the best version of it. It's not just, oh, I put a video up and I didn't put any thought behind it, but I've checked off that I have a video on my listing. It's, does that video answer the need? Does that video educate? Does that video help drive conversions?
Well, and Julian, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can't do multivariant testing within Amazon, correct?
Correct. Yeah, you can only do A/B 2 versions. That's it. You're limited. Even there, that's a really good point. And
for us, for example, if we were adding a video to a product page, we might have 3 different variants where we're testing 3 different videos. So the question isn't so much, is a video a good thing?
Right.
We generally know that, yes, having a video is a good thing. The question is, which video is the optimal video? Whereas I think that's probably a limitation then on the Amazon side. You would have to kind of run multiple tests to be able to answer that question.
Yeah. And you would have to do one for 2 to 3 weeks. When that one's over, do version B and C for 3 weeks, compare B and C to A and B, and then do you have C and D? So yeah, it's not as easy.
For advancement.
Yeah, it goes to Brittany's point of like, regardless of the channel, this is an iterative process, right? Small gains that compound over time. Sometimes you can iterate a little faster than others depending on the channel. But it also goes like to this idea of the level of certainty and how you determine the actual winners around these. And to the earlier point of in the early days of Amazon, cobbling together all these crazy sheets. I remember working for months with some data scientists to try to build in like statistical significance calculations for any of the tests we were running. And this whole labor intensive process. And at least now with native split testing, you should be able to understand statistical significance and like try to isolate for confounding variables and that sort of thing. But at the same time, with any of these, there's some amount of fuzziness of, well, yes, the metrics are saying this, but how do I determine the winner? How do I explain that winner? How do I replicate that winner in future tests? So I'm just curious, both on the black and white, how do you look at tests from a metrics and data perspective, but then also from a qualitative standpoint of understanding the why? How do you kind of meld those two together to tell a cohesive narrative to the client? And Brittany, maybe we start with you again as kind of the original of them here and go to Julian.
Yeah, I definitely think DTC has an advantage here on the Amazon side. 1,000%, right? I mean, we could do an entire podcast on data, probably multiple podcasts. So I'll try and be brief. We really track everything. Yes, we're absolutely looking at kind of the standard macro KPIs of conversions and revenue and all that. But on the DTC side, I want to know every click, every page view, looking at time on site, bounce rate, all of those different metrics. I would say this becomes most important when you're trying to understand why something didn't perform as well as you expected it to. Mm-hmm. Or when going back to the multivariate testing, when you're trying to compare variants against each other to understand, hey, why did this video or why did this product name perform better than this one? Where is the drop-off points happening? How did making this change impact the user's behavior at a granular level to really form the hypothesis for those follow-up tests versus just taking that big picture step back of, hey, variant 2 reached 99% confidence for outperforming the control. Great, but why? Why did this one perform better compared to the first variant we were testing or one of the other variants?
So when we think about CRO on Amazon, I think that there's a lot of data that's missing to be able to speak confidently to tests in terms of the traditional percent confidence of something. And I think on Amazon, having a bunch of small tests, it could be dependent on what your goal is. And if you know that your listing has, say, 1 million glance views and your conversion rate is 1%, which is under the standard, that means that it's not a traffic issue, it's a conversion issue. So you can run a test on what can I do to help improve conversions. And so then you can say, hey, this idea of us doing an SEO sprint to improve your copy is going to help lead to conversions. And then at the end of the test period, you're able to say, oh, our conversion rate increased X% pre and post. But again, that's just one variable that you're testing. And then I think the variables outside of that can, to some extent, impede the test on Amazon. And it's harder to isolate those, in my opinion, on Amazon to really understand the nature or the positivity of an A/B test.
What KPIs can you track on Amazon, Julian? I'm curious. Is it just conversions, or do you see like revenue and add to carts and some of those other things?
Yeah, you can see like sessions, you can see clicks, you can see glance views is another one. You can see.
Okay.
But Brittany, with your question, you're speaking specifically within an A/B test, right? If I run a split test, what are the metrics I'm going to be able to get in that split test specifically?
Yeah, a lot of them just go back to conversion, and it gives you, hey, you should use version B because the likelihood of conversion is 80% with version B versus version A.
But you're not going to get like a heat map of this version versus the other.
It is very much just like A and B, this one versus that one kind of a thing. You don't get to get no heat maps, unfortunately, because those are fun.
So is this gap potentially, watch this segue happen here. I'm going to, a good ending point for us. We have an understanding of where we've been and where we are when it comes to CRO, but a good podcast conversation always includes a healthy dose of prognostication. Is this gap that currently exists on Amazon as it relates to testing an opportunity, a direction where you see things going for CRO on Amazon, Julian? And then by the same token, where do you see things going, Brittany, on Google as it relates to CRO as we move forward?
I think so. I think that with the development of AI and with the way that things are working and Amazon's trying to understand even more about customers and purchase behavior, I think that there's opportunities ahead where CRO will be even more relevant than it is now. It's exciting to think about the opportunities where you can tailor make an experience for a product for the real intended user of that product. And I'm excited specifically with Cosmo and Rufus and the impact that that's already having on Amazon. And it's still in beta. So it's kind of endless possibilities when it comes to the data that we'll be able to utilize in the future.
Yeah, an important distinction I feel like we've hit on here is a CRO outside of Amazon, right? You can manipulate a lot of variables down to like the UX and UI directly, whereas Amazon, you're pretty much just swapping creative assets, main image, A+ images, bullet point content, that sort of thing. So I feel like we've seen Amazon be able to generate 10 different DSP asset sizes from the same asset with AI. So you can imagine if a main image, you had 10 and you just said split them, right? And you run 10 tests that are generated from your brand assets. Like that's a cool feature that wouldn't be a crazy big lift from where we're at now.
Then you could say CRO is exploding on Amazon.
Yeah. Full explosion. It describes,
and that's a really good point, right? Because a lot of the questions that come up is, just to give you guys an example of video content, it's like, should we make this video content brand focused or product focused? And when you say product focused, a lot of the time it's like, is that really worth it? Is it going to matter? That's a time suck for us. How do we know what version of a product-focused video is going to be best, and being able to have the ability to test multiple, even if it's just 2 slides or 2 sequences that are different within a video that could give you more data. It's exciting to think about, but I don't think we're there yet, obviously.
I want that for you, Julian.
Me too.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
And on the D2C side, as far as just the next steps, I mean, we touched on it a little bit at the beginning. I think AI is definitely in its infancy. The dream, right, would be to have this completely personalized website for every user. And I think some of the big guys are doing that to a degree. And I think for me, I'm really curious to see how that trickles down and becomes more and more accessible to those medium-sized and small businesses, how that technology becomes easier to use, more integrated, and more accessible to those smaller companies who don't have data science teams that they can rely on to create personalized homepages for everybody.
This has been a great conversation today, and I look forward to having you both on maybe toward the end of the year, start of next year, to see if the things that you're hoping for in the future actually are the reality for brands and for agencies working in this. So thank you both for joining us. It was great talking to you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a treat.